Hello and welcome to the First Count with Theo Davies-Lewis on Oxide Radio. Today we're broadcasting from Thenford House, a historic Georgian site in northern Hamptonshire, surrounded by 1,500 acres of beautiful gardens and fields. But this is no ordinary country house. This is the home of one of the most influential political minds of our generation, Lord Michael Heseltine. He was an MP from 1966 to 2001, and after Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, Lord Heseltine became Environment Secretary and then Defence Secretary. But as political historians will tell you, there was a major fallout in 1986 over a complex dispute involving the future of Westland helicopters. He quit and walked out in the middle of a cabinet meeting. Yet this wasn't the end of Lord Heseltine's career on the front line of politics. In 1990, with Thatcher apparently losing popularity among the public and her own party, he launched a leadership bid. Despite not winning, he inflicted enough of a blow on the PM's prestige for her to resign. With John Major rising to power, Lord Heseltine became Deputy Prime Minister in the last 2 years of Major's premiership, a period beset with Conservative disputes over the UK's relationship with the EU. Sound familiar? Heseltine retired as an MP and entered the Lords, where he continues to speak out on issues. Most recently, he was an economic advisor to Number 10, advisor to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Growth, and advisor on plans on Swansea City Deal, amongst other things. And I'm delighted to say that Lord Heseltine joins me now. Thank you for having us here today, Lord Heseltine.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
And before we go into the issues then of things such as Brexit, the position of Theresa May, the future of the Conservative Party, for Oxford students who perhaps didn't grow up looking at you in the cabinet, when was the start of your sort of political mind? When did you start thinking about politics? Because you grew up in Wales, you went to Shrewsbury School, you went to Oxford. When was the starting point for you?
I didn't come from a political family, although my father was, I think, the only officer in his mess in 1945 to vote Conservative. But we were not a political family. I remember joining the Conservative Party. It was unpredictable. I was walking down a main street of Swansea when I saw this headline, Henry Kirby, Conservative candidate, Swansea West. I crossed the road and said, "Can I help?" And that was 10 days before I went up to Oxford in 1951.
And then you got to Oxford, you were president of the Oxford Union. You were engaged in politics then. What influence did Oxford have on you as a person, and vice versa, perhaps?
Oh, without the slightest shadow of doubt, a formative influence. I went to a great public school, Shrewsbury, but it didn't work for me. It may have been my fault, whatever, but I left it with a track record which was extremely undistinguished. And I didn't feel that really reflected the energies and abilities I had. But Oxford changed all that. Here I was amongst, the men and women that would form my life in many different ways. There was the respect for people who had different views, for people who wanted to try something new. And one just became a different person, frankly, in the confidence-building atmosphere and the intellectual freedoms of the university. It was an amazing 3 years.
And would you say then, because of how perhaps Shrewsbury didn't do much for you as a person, or you didn't thrive there, when you were in Oxford, did you take anything away from your childhood which perhaps did actually benefit you there? Maybe because you've always said that Wales was your home, and both of us grew up in South Wales. Is there anything you took from there which perhaps helped you in this environment which was full of competition, confidence, and politics?
Well, we're talking about time at Shrewsbury or time at Oxford? At Oxford. Oh, without any doubt, the fact that one had the enormous privilege of being president of the Oxford Union, and the invaluable experience of being engaged in conservative politics. There I got to Oxford. I joined the City of Oxford Conservative Association, the Oxford University Conservative Association, and the Oxford Union. Now that tells you really all you need to know, that quite obviously I saw Oxford as the opening of a potential political experience from day one.
And then you went into business shortly after you left as well. And I think what a lot of people wonder, they know about the letter and the famous envelope story and what you were thinking about, what your objectives were. Why did you move into business and publishing then? Why was there...
Well, that was one of those quirky experiences that just happened. Originally, I was going to be an article clerk to a firm of accountants in Swansea. Something said to me, well, could I not go to university? My father agreed. I was going to do a BCom at either Bristol or Reading. But they wanted, as is commonplace now, certain standards to be achieved in the higher school certificates. And Oxford and Cambridge offered me places without any such conditions. So I went to Oxford. And when I left Oxford, I was still going to be a chartered accountant. And I'd taken the 3-year degree as part of the 5 years which you had to do to get your accountancy qualifications. Going to by then, London to be articled, I was offered £7 a week by Pete Marwick Mitchell, the firm, which was double what article clerks got at the time, but only half of what my peer group of graduates got, which was £12-13 a week. But I had £1,000, which my grandparents had saved in penny packages over 20 years for me. And so I thought, well, that's all right. I've got £1,000. That's 3 years articles. That's £300 a year, £6 a week, plus my £7. I can live at the same rate as my peer group of new graduates. And that was when, just flash, I thought, but I won't have my £1,000. So I found another friend, Ian Josephs, who also had £1,000. And we bought a boarding house in Notting Hill Gate. We had 11 rooms, we occupied 2 and let out 9. And of course we lived extremely well, but can't believe it, 18 months later we sold it for double what we'd put into it. And so we each had £2,000. We bought a hotel up the road. And so I'd begun a business career on a tiny scale, but of course the London property business was very fast moving at that time.
Yeah, and with that then you probably brought that experience into politics and what you actually achieved then, because you were elected as an MP, you're an MP in 2 seats, and obviously eventually then Thatcher comes to power, you are front and centre really of her new cabinet, a new one nation country perhaps. What was it like actually serving in the cabinet then? When Thatcher won, how did you feel? Did you realise this was your opportunity to do something special?
I'll come back to that, but can I fill in on one gap? Because you see, the business acumen that perhaps I have a certain amount was significantly developed as when I was treasurer of the Oxford Union. The Oxford Union was facing the classic business dilemma. It was losing members and therefore had a shortfall of cash. And the debate was, do we cut back to what we can afford on the membership levels we have, or do we invest and go for a much bigger membership? And I was the leader of the latter, the entrepreneurial argument. Well, we did. That's where the nightclub in the Oxford Union came from.
Yeah, I still enjoy that now anyway.
Indeed, and that's where it came from, plus various other things. We got a huge increase in membership. But it was the classic argument of the retrenchers when things are going wrong, the investors who try to see an optimistic way forward. And that was a very, very important part of my very early career at Oxford. Now, going on to your important question, the 1979 election came, of course, after the horrendous experiences of the winter of discontent and the collapse of the Labour government under trade union militancy. And we were like an army represented with the opportunity to win, because most of us were Ted Heath's government. We'd been there before. We'd seen the dilemma of the who governs argument. We'd lost the election in 1974, and then we'd seen the Labour government overwhelmed by the same problems. So we were back in power, and we knew what we had to do. The trade union revised legislative arrangement was very important. It was my privilege to carry through the right to buy, which of course was one of the great social revolutions of our time. It was Mr. Heath's policy, the right to buy. It was announced when he was the leader of the Conservative Party in 1974. But the idea came from Peter Walker, who spotted Tory councils beginning to experiment with the idea. Anyway, it was my responsibility to carry it through, which we did. At the same time, we recreated the private rented market, which proved a huge social benefit to help people get into housing and all of that. And also, it didn't last very long, but I secured at the time of the right to buy a very significant reinvestment program of the money that came from the sale of council houses. I think 75% of it went into new social housing. That didn't last long, but it was very much a one nation approach, enfranchising a generation, yes, but also providing the new social housing that we still need.
And then going on to other positions that you were Defence Secretary. Obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, the controversy with the helicopters, who should buy them, and obviously you resigned after that. And I'm sure we can talk about what that sort of encompassed. But when you actually took the decision to leave the cabinet then, is that something you ever regretted after everything that happened?
I've regretted it every minute. It was wasted 4 years of my life. But I have never had any doubts. I was right to do it. And indeed there was no honourable choice, frankly. But it's wrong to concentrate on the helicopters.
Yeah.
That's what everybody talks about. What was this small company in west of England? It's not the issue. The issue is, how does a cabinet work? What rights have you got as a cabinet minister? Where does your personal integrity stand faced with behaviour which was quite unacceptable by the Prime Minister? Basically, she didn't command a majority in her own government on this issue. There'd been 2 meetings which I had attended, and she'd lost on both occasions. And it should have been my right to put the argument to Cabinet, which she denied me. So you have to decide as Defence Secretary, are you prepared to be treated in that way? Knowing full well that if I had accepted it, I would have been rubbished by the number 10 machine, political machine, to the journalists, many of whom were enthralled to the Thatcher regime and would have just used it as an easy opportunity to undermine everything I stood for.
And do you think it's incidents like that then that led to figures such as Blair and Cameron actually having smaller and smaller groups in government actually controlling everything? Because you had the Quad in 2010 to 2015, and you had Blair with Alistair Campbell and Mandelson calling the shots. Is it because you have so many strong-minded people like yourself with these sort of incidents that sort of drew people to actually think, no, we'll do it our own way, and have a small group of people controlling everything?
I don't believe in all these simplifications. There's nothing new in politics. There have always been people who ran a tight ship. There have always been more consensual politicians, and so it will always be. Margaret Thatcher was very much to one wing of the Conservative Party. John Major was very much a consensual politician, based, I think, much more on the one nation concepts. They come and they go. I keep always saying to people, there's nothing new in politics. There's always precedents.
And before we move on to talk about things that are happening today, obviously something that is perhaps one of the most famous moments or most prolific moments in the last 25 years or 30 years in politics is when Thatcher, the sort of the coup that began against Thatcher. And I read an article before we came here today about how it was the very Welsh coup, because you had Geoffrey Howe, there was figures such as Lord Brian Griffiths in the article talking about what was happening. Tell us now, after so many years that it's happened, and I'm sure you've been asked this question so many times, but what was going through your head during the time, of course, with unpopularity of Thatcher in the party and with the public? What was going through your head to actually challenge her for the leadership?
Well, I wasn't thinking of doing that. My task for me, my personal career, was based on the assumption that I had to survive in national politics, and that whoever became the next leader of the Conservative Party would bring me back. I always believed that. That explains everything that I did. Now, survival meant playing a role. Margaret was getting more and more unpopular over the poll tax, which was a massive disaster as a piece of policy. And she was articulating Euroscepticism in more and more graphic phraseology. So two issues about which I felt strongly provided me with a platform which Fleet Street was only too anxious to underpin. And I became more and more prominent, which led to more and more speculation that I was likely to be the next leader of the party. But I always thought she would go. I thought she, particularly on her 10th anniversary, it was, there's a shelf life in most things in life, and certainly there is in Premiership. You just can't go on. But she didn't seem to have any intention of going. And it was Geoffrey Howe's resignation that triggered the whole issue. And then Geoffrey was a good friend of mine, but there was no. I was shattered when he resigned. I was speaking to, I think, students in Portsmouth when the press said Geoffrey Howe's resigned. I couldn't believe it. I tried to find a phone to confirm it. Anyway, that was one thing. But his speech, again, with which I had no prior knowledge, when he turned and he used the final words, "It is now for others to determine the way forward," I was sitting almost alongside him. And of course, bang, the spotlight shoved me right into the profile. What are you going to do? And I walked out of that debate. The whole thing collapsed as a debate very rapidly after Geoffrey sat down. And I passed another friend of mine, Michael Jopling, who had been the chief whip. And I said, "No, what the hell am I going to do, Michael?" He said, "You do nothing. You'll be leader of the opposition in 18 months. And I remember saying, "I don't want to be leader of the opposition." And anyway, the rest is history.
And do you think that Thatcher would have actually had you as a successor then? You said that you thought that she would actually, or she had a high regard for you.
Well, she told others in the early 80s that she thought I was her natural successor. I don't say she went on believing that, but she certainly did believe it in the early 80s.
And then, of course, you went on to be Deputy Prime Minister, still having an influence now on several issues. Let's talk about the things that are prevalent today then. Of course, you've been a vocal critic of Brexit. You described it as the greatest constitutional crisis of modern times. And now Brexit is perhaps in some way, or a hard Brexit is in jeopardy, isn't it?
I hope.
But do you think it's fair that since the people voted for a Brexit, that we should sort of water it down or actually not implement it in the first place?
It's really what you think about parliamentary democracy. I believe that Parliament is sovereign, and Parliament can make up its own mind and should do. I have spent a very significant proportion, nearly half probably, of my political career fighting to overturn the mandate of the elected government. Of course, it was always Labour governments who I opposed in the election campaign, and once they got elected, they came forward with their manifestos, which they, in large measure, implemented in the teeth of any opposition that I could contribute. And in some cases, we managed to stop them, even though we didn't have a majority. The example I'd give you is the nationalisation of the ports, which I actually personally led the opposition, and we destroyed the bill. But then we went for another election, and we reversed the policies of the Labour Party. So Parliament is where the action is and should be.
What about the people then? The people voted.
Well, but they didn't really, did they?
No, they did. It was a referendum.
Be realistic. What they voted for was tougher controls on immigration and, in very large measure, a reaction to the austerity that followed from the 2008 crash. And you listen to all the vox pops. I'm sick of austerity. I'm sick of the fact that my living standards aren't rising. Of course, the Brexiteers and one or two of the more raucous voices of Fleet Street put the blame on Europe. You've always got to find someone to blame in politics. First rule, find someone to blame. And but the fact is, it was the economic malaise which again made it easy to blame the immigrants. So it's a totally predictable rerun. And it's 1974 all over again when we had the Who Governs election in the miners' conflict. And the last week, the Who Governs issue disintegrated. As Wilson said, we'll catch them in the last week on prices. And that's a large measure what's happened in this just general election. It started off massive poll leads, and we then come to a situation when, in the end, it was people's living standards that were the big determinant.
My point was that you're seen as one of the biggest political figures in Conservative Party history, in modern British political history. But people will look at you and think that you were somebody who were advocating joining the euro, and that would have been a disaster, arguably, for our country. So why would people think that what you say about Brexit is actually correct or valid?
I think we will join the euro.
When?
Perhaps in your generation.
But we're not
in mine.
So does that?
But just to be factual, I never advocated joining the euro.
Well, you stood with all the Labour politicians.
Indeed, as a possibility, not as a fact. And so I've just told you exactly my position. I believe we will, in the future, join the euro. And that's what I was saying then, and it's what I'm saying now.
But does that mean then we'd have to be a part of the EU to join the euro then? No, because that doesn't.
We will rejoin the European Union.
So do you think that we will leave the EU and then rejoin?
I'm not sure about that. I hope not.
But the thing is, though, a lot of people would say it's just going to happen. Though there's not going to be a reverse of this. Even whatever people like you and whether the figures in the Labour Party or the Nationalists and the SNP, Brexit is very likely to happen now. Do you think not, or?
I was brought up in early politics where people talked about the irreversibility of socialism. In my early life, when I was in the same university as you are now, it looked as though the newly emancipated empire would all go left. It may not happen overnight, but remorselessly, one country after another elected left-wing governments and all of that. France and Italy, in my early life, the time I'm talking about your age, 1/3 were voting communist. And so a lot of people in the Conservative Party felt that, well, we've got to hold the line, put a finger in the dike, stop the rot. But the idea of reversing it was simply for the zealots. Well, I perhaps am a zealot. I was one of those who was in the forefront of every battle to reverse this leftward drift. If you look across the world today, basically communism, socialism is bust. No one believes in it. No one's practicing it. Those of us who, if you like, stuck our necks out, those of us who dug in, those of us who had a more positive agenda, proved to be right. Now, I've given you my reasons why Brexit happened, immigration and economic resentment of 2008. But your generation, if I may dare speak for them in your presence, they don't believe a word of this. They actually believe they've been cheated by an elderly generation looking backwards to a past which no longer exists and failing to understand the totally interrelated world in which the young people feel they want to play a role. And that's, when you look at what's happened in the last election, huge surge of students coming in to vote, partially because of Brexit. They hate Brexit. And I'm totally on their side. The idea that our huge marketplace, our cultural heritage and history is going to be somehow divorced from us is quite unacceptable.
Do you at times think then that you're in the wrong party?
No, I do not think that at all. I am a conservative. I am one of those people who believes in the role of individuals, in the dynamics of competition, the rights of individuals, and the sense of obligation that comes from power and privilege to those less fortunate than oneself. Some people call it paternalism, some call it noblesse oblige. You can use any abuse that they like, but all the great Tory leaders that I look back to, they all believed in this one nation approach.
But surely that Conservative Party that you knew has changed, arguably, and now even with Brexit, even if Theresa May doesn't believe it, she says Brexit means Brexit, or whatever Brexit's going to take place. It's not the party perhaps that you are loyal to and have feelings towards. It's not the same party.
Let's just look back before we get too dug in on this argument. Think of the recent Tory leaders who have actually secured a majority for the Conservative Party. David Cameron, much more popular than the Conservative Party, totally one nation in his approach. Before him, you have to go back to John Major, exactly the same story. So why should I despair when I see that the only way Conservatives can actually win is if they are led by leaders who are more popular than the Conservative Party? And by the way, this applied to Boris Johnson winning the mayoralty of London. And by the way, it applies to Ruth Davidson in Scotland today. People who can get out ahead of the Conservative Party and lead it. Now, my humble experience is the only way they can lead it successfully is on a one-nation agenda. And indeed, Mrs. May herself has adopted that approach.
Has she though?
Yes.
In the campaign though? Why did the Tories lose the election? Surely it was because they didn't actually show that one nation conservatism that you talked about and Cameron talked about.
No, they lost the election because the economics were against them. That people are fed up. They want change. That's what they always want when they feel the pressure on their pockets. And part of the pressure they wanted was associated with immigration because that was presented as part of the problem.
But don't you think that now she's in a position which is difficult for her to lead that one nation conservatism you talk about?
Well, it's extremely difficult for anybody in the present situation because effectively there's no majority. I remember again in 1974, the whips saying to me, Michael, we're in the by-election business. You see, there are certain things that are totally predictable in politics. First of all governments become unpopular after 18 months, 2 years. The clamour for change becomes crescendo loud. The by-elections start to take their toll. And that's when this government is certainly at risk. I don't believe there's a risk in the immediate future because, who wants a general election now? Who would vote down this government now and precipitate another general election? Well, I can tell you the Scots Nats won't because they know that Ruth Davidson is on a high and they could lose more seats, especially if they precipitate an early general election. So they won't do it. The Labour Party, they might, because they can see that the drift of events is going with them. I don't think the DUP are going to vote for an early general election. So I think that this government will get its Queen's speech. Its problem is that even with the DUP, it's wafer-thin majority, and the by-elections lie ahead, even if they can count on all the Conservative members in the House of Commons.
But do you think it's right to have this deal with the DUP then? Because of the peace process, the views they have into, and also considering that Theresa May wanted an outright majority, she didn't get one, and then people would say that she's got no right to govern in some sense. What do you think that she should do?
Well, I think John Major made a very impressive intervention on the subject. I think there is a lack of stability in the conflict between the DUP on the one hand and Ruth Davidson's type of conservative approach in Scotland. And that Ruth Davidson, the Scottish Tories, are every bit as important as the DUP. So the DUP arrangements, if there are any, and who's to know? I don't know. Don't look to me like cement.
But do you think that then, in the next few weeks and months, that we'll have some sort of, perhaps a clear copy of what happened with you and Thatcher, that she became so unpopular in the party and in the country that there will be some sort of attempt to oust her?
There'll be endless speculation, because that's what journalists do. But there is no consensus on who else.
Who do you think that would be a good leader?
I'm not getting involved in that because, no, I'll tell you why I'm not getting involved in it. It's important that they have a new leader for the next election. That I'm absolutely clear about. But much more important is what they're going to say. Because I can predict what the next couple of years are going to look like. And it's not pretty. Where's the upside? Where's the good news? Very difficult to see. And so if the next election is a rerun of the policies of this election, then Jeremy Corbyn is at the gates of number 10.
And moving slightly away from the Conservative Party, and obviously we've had this terrible fire that's taken place in Grenfell Tower in West London, and not to politicise the issue, but looking at this specific case, with the reports that have been coming out with residents saying that this has happened because they don't care about the poor, it's all about the rich actually doing whatever they want. With somebody who's being involved with housing and, re-energising some of the deprived areas in our country, can you relate to that in the sense that these people, or there is parts of this country which do feel left behind, and often there can be sort of tragic consequences, as we've seen with this fire?
Look, everyone is utterly horrified by what has happened. I think that the local community has made a huge impression on those of us who've watched from outside. And the fire services have been remarkable. The whole thing has been a tragedy of massive proportions, and out of these things sometimes comes some rather tear-jerkingly moving experiences. I'm not going to get involved in a dialogue which has political overtones. I think that the Prime Minister is absolutely right to go for a proper inquiry. I think that the need for answers, and answers quickly, is absolutely central. And I fully understand the sort of comments that have been made by people under huge emotional stress, and I don't wish to disown them in any way or to separate myself from them. But on the other hand, I have someone who's lived through many political crises. There is always a need for government to, whilst recognising the tensions, be careful with the language and the commitments that it makes, because it's so easy to make misjudgments under the pressure of those events.
And looking ahead then to the next few years, for somebody like you, how can you actually have an influence in the future? As you said, you had 10 broadcasting slots on one day this week. Is that something that you think that you'd be able to actually have an influence in and actually have a positive effect on in the future? Is that how you do it? Or?
Well, my ability to influence anything is now much diminished because I've just been sacked from the role I had as a government advisor. I mean, call me what you will, but I was working on various aspects of government policy, like industrial strategy, actually on David Cameron's initiative to transform the conditions of 100 of the most deprived communities. I was involved in that, and it was a very important initiative. And then, of course, I was doing the extension of the work I did in the 80s in East London and on a commission to look at the extension of all that to the to Southend and Canterbury from London out to the sea. So I was happy as a sandboy, frankly, to have the privilege of doing all that. But I was a National Infrastructure Commissioner as well, and the Swansea Bay, as you said. Yes, we mustn't forget that. Anyway, that came to a sudden end,
yes.
And so my ability to influence anything now is seriously diminished. But does that mean I have to be quiet? Well, it's not. You see, I don't ring up these journalists and say, "Please, can you report me?" or "Please, will you come and interview me?" They ring me.
Yeah, as we did.
As you did. And so as long as anybody rings,
you answer the phone.
I'll answer the phone, you know.
And looking at students then as well, are you optimistic for these students? As you say, they were voting in the election. You think that Brexit's affected them. Do you think looking ahead now in the next 10 years that students and young people in particular will be getting into politics more and will be having, or even politicians will be directing specific issues towards them and trying to appeal to them more?
I think yes is the answer. I think that the revolution that's going on is a communications revolution. It's this thing in one form or other. And I think one of the things that happened in this election, well, it's really a rerun of the Obama campaign, because that's where there was this huge similar surge. I said there's nothing new in politics. Well, whether the Conservative Party woke up to the impact of it in the way that the Labour Party did, I don't know. People will be asking that question. But in terms of the input into thinking, community thinking, collegiate approach, most of my life there has been a monopoly of support for right-wing politics in Fleet Street. And it gets pretty hysterical at times. Well, I have to say that I've been on the benefiting side of that. I have learned to live with it. But I think something new has happened now. I think that the more raucous of the tabloids, the more the students shake their heads with disbelief, say, you know, I think this helped Jeremy Corbyn. I think that where he was getting splash headlines of every sort of abuse, much of it justified in my language, the students were saying, well, this guy isn't so bad, you know, he's saying sensible things and he's actually offering to knock us 40,000 quid off our debt. So I think that the dialogue on the machines that everyone's now got is compensating for the previous monopoly of the tabloids. So I think, yes, this is a phenomenon that's here to stay. And whether the students will overcome their previous apathy is another matter. They may say, having done all this communicating, they may still say, oh, they're all in it for what they can get out of it. They're all, you know, a lot of whatever they want to call us, and then not vote. If only they'd voted in the Brexit in the way they voted in their general election. But
yeah, well, do you think that they'll have the opportunity again to vote, have another crucial vote like that then, and whether there's another, they have to vote on the Brexit deal or they have to vote on another general election soon? Do you think they'll be the crucial vote then?
Yeah, I think that there will be another crucial vote.
And young people will be the major influence, you think?
Well, it's more than that. You know, well, it is the same, but let me just make the obvious point. 2% of the largely older electorate move on every year. They are replaced by 2% of a younger generation. And we all know what the breakdown of those two components are. The Brexiteers are dying, the younger pro-Europeans are emerging. And it happens remorselessly, 2% either side a year. And that tells you something about the problems that the government faces in the next election.
Exciting times ahead.
Always.
Lord Heseltine, thank you.
Thank you.